weird starts happening. And the movie ends with a genre-defining scene. Get that bag, Granny. If you're a nun in this convent, you're not going to be escaping. Does Sydney Sweeney get naked in the movie Immaculate? It was pretty hilarious. Hey fellow scary movie lovers, welcome back to Nonstop Horror, where we celebrate our love of the genre in fun and exciting ways. My name is Cameron, and what is more fun and exciting than watching a horror movie in theaters? This past weekend we went and saw the newly released Immaculate in theaters, and it was a great time, and this is just going to be going over my review of the film. You may have just seen this in the theaters yourself and want to see someone else's opinion, or maybe you're trying to gauge whether or not you should go see it, and this video will help you out. I love seeing horror movies in theaters, especially if there are other people in the theater with you, because you never know what kind of reactions you're going to get. There are usually at least one or two people that are very vocal about their reaction to the movie, and that did happen for us, which I'll get to in a little bit. So for Immaculate, we went in pretty blind. I think I may have read the synopsis on IMDb prior to going in, but we didn't watch any trailers or anything like that. I knew Sydney Sweeney was in it, but didn't dive too much into it. I just want to interject here and say that I did watch the trailer after filming this video, and I'm glad that I went in blind because the trailer gives away so much of the movie. There's even like a special trailer that just has the entire screaming scene from the end of the movie, just the audio, but still I'm glad that I was surprised by most of this movie and didn't watch the trailer going in. That's all. This movie is directed by Michael Mohan and stars Sydney Sweeney, as I said. Sydney Sweeney, known for her role in Handmaid's Tale, White Lotus, Euphoria, and others. And Mohan and Sweeney actually worked together previously in a movie called The Voyeurs from 2021. And fun fact about the movie revealed by Sweeney herself, her two grandmothers star in the movie as well. There are quick glimpses of them in a couple of scenes, which is kind of neat, especially if you're Sydney Sweeney's grandmother. Get that bag, Granny. Before I get too far into the review, I am going to say that there are going to be spoilers in this movie. I don't know if I would trust myself to say that this is going to be a spoiler-free review and just trust that I'm not going to say anything to spoil it. So we're just going to say that this review will have spoilers in it. So I guess Sydney Sweeney auditioned for this movie a few years ago, and then the project kind of got shelved, and then she was the one who actually revived it, came on as a producer, and that's how we got the final version of this movie, Immaculate. So the basic premise of the movie is Sydney Sweeney's character is recruited for a role at a convent in the Italian countryside, and of course, as we all know, weird starts happening. And at this convent that she goes to, they're essentially taking care of older nuns as they near death, kind of like a hospice situation, which sounds weird. Sounds very similar to hostage situation, which also accurately describes the convent. The opening scene really does a great job of setting up the fact that basically if you're a nun in this convent, you're not going to be escaping, and if you do, there will be grave consequences. And if you take more than 2 seconds to evaluate the title of the movie, you might guess that it has to do with pregnancy and essentially the Immaculate Conception, which is conception without the original sin or sex. The movie is pretty gory at times, and it should go without saying, but I think most people probably don't eat during horror movies. But I was just sitting there enjoying my chicky tendies, watching a bunch of gory shit happen on the screen, and I'm usually not fazed by that, and I wasn't fazed by it in Immaculate, but in the moment I just kind of stare at the screen as I'm eating, and I think most people probably would be grossed out by now. So all of that to say that there are some gory parts, and one of the biggest plot points of the movie is that they essentially have the original nail that was driven through Christ's palm as he was hung on the cross, and they found blood remnants on the nail, blood tissue, and so they're using that to impregnate the young nuns that come into the convent, a la Catholic Jurassic Park essentially. And of course, at one point, Sydney Sweeney's character, Sister Cecilia, becomes pregnant, which means that the process has worked. We do find out later in the movie that they have tried for decades, essentially, trying to make this work, as they reveal a bunch of incomplete babies in jars in a certain room that they go into. Now, I know that the question is going to come up with a lot of you people out there. Does Sydney Sweeney get naked in the movie Immaculate? And all I'm going to say to that is you're a bunch of sick out there. And also, she kind of does, but that's really not the point of the movie, is it? During the movie, she finds out she's pregnant, and Sydney Sweeney at one point requests to see a doctor on the outside, and they basically refuse to let her, which is obviously a huge red flag, so she freaks out. And at one point during the movie, she comes up with this ruse to get out of the convent, And so one of the priests is driving her to a hospital because she faked this like really bloody emergency. So of course we're rooting for her to escape, and then at one point a nun that stayed back finds this butchered chicken under the bed, so they know that that's where the blood came from. She calls the priest, they catch her, blah blah blah, and she comes back, and then they brand her feet as punishment for some reason. But that's one of the biggest flaws in the movie, is that she put that chicken right under the bed, where like the most obvious place for something odd and suspicious to be hidden. She could have, put it in the closet or a different room, but I've never been in that situation, so I don't know if I would make that same mistake. Another thing that kind of bugged me is that at some point, the one younger nun that Sydney Sweeney even has any sort of relationship with, which is basically just like they talk to each other often, she gets her tongue cut out because she was basically saying that this place was up, and so she gets her tongue cut off, and then Sydney Sweeney never interacts with her again, and we never see her again, except it might have been, they don't make it very clear, but there is a body that Sydney Sweeney sees towards the end of the movie that could have been that girl. So I guess that remains to be confirmed. The movie also kind of plays out with their chapters named first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, and as we get into the third trimester, she's nearing the birth of the baby, and she's in the doctor's office for a checkup. The doctor goes away, and one of the older nuns stays back with Sydney Sweeney in the doctor's office, and she's just like so enamored by the ultrasound. And in that moment, Sydney Sweeney, realizing that this is basically her last chance to get the out of there, she kills the nun with a cross, which is pretty badass, and they show her beating her head in. Like I said, a lot of gore, and then she kills the head priest. I don't know if he has a specific name. And then she goes to burn down the lab where they're doing all the experimentation and stuff. And the younger priest who caught her when she tried to escape earlier goes in there, and he's trying to, convince her to stop, blah, blah, blah. Fight ensues, and she basically lights the whole room up with the priest inside as she escapes. And then he somehow turns into the Incredible Hulk and survives the fire, breaks down the door, and begins to chase her. And she goes into the catacombs, which at the beginning of the film they said were off limits, which was great foreshadowing, letting us know that we'd be down there at some point. And a small chase ensues down in the catacombs, which is where she found that body that I mentioned earlier, which could have been her friend. And of course they told them that the catacombs were off limits because there's a way to escape down there. Sydney Sweeney finds this escape hole, and as she begins climbing out of it, the priest catches up to her. So he drags her back out of the hole, and there's a little fight that ensues, and he basically gets on top of her and starts attempting to cut out the devil baby from her belly. And she has a knife, so she stabs him in the neck, of course, which kills him. And then she does escape out of the catacombs into the open countryside. And the movie ends with a genre-defining scene with Sydney Sweeney basically planting herself in horror history as one of the great modern scream queens. We have a close-up of her face for about a minute and a half, maybe longer, of her just screaming, giving birth to this baby devil, and yeah, it just locks right up on her face. We're staring at her right in the eyes, makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but that's what horror is supposed to do, right? And then she eventually gives birth to the baby. We don't see the baby at all, but we hear her making some weird old little pug noises. And then she starts to walk away after, of course, biting the umbilical cord herself, severing it that way. And so she walks away. We see the shape of the devil baby in the background just laying on the ground, but it's blurred out. She grabs a giant ass rock, walks back to the baby, raises the rock above her head, and smashes the baby. We can assume it kills it, but it just cuts to black at that moment. So it's a very intense ending with a lot of great finality. We're not really left wondering a whole lot because Sydney Sweeney obviously just saved herself and killed what could have been the end of the world, I guess. And in case that explanation didn't really drive home how weird and intense this final scene is, the people behind us, once the screen cut to black, just said what the literally 5 times. It was pretty hilarious because my wife and I, we were thinking the same thing but weren't really vocalizing it. But the people behind us did it for us. So going into this, I will say Immaculate was better than expected. Like I said, we went in pretty blind, but after recent flops like The Nun and The Nun 2, I didn't have high hopes for nun horror. But Immaculate has started to slowly revive that assumption that I've made in my own head. I don't think I would see it again, but I do think it is worth watching at least once. And you can't really talk about Immaculate without mentioning the similarities between it and Rosemary's Baby, except obviously Immaculate ends a little bit differently, with Sydney Sweeney essentially eliminating all of the villains in her story, whereas in Rosemary's Baby, that's not quite the case. Biggest flaws were that the jump scares were pretty cliche and expected, like you could definitely predict them. That chicken under the bed scene just seemed a little like not very well thought out for someone who's trying to escape it for their life. The tongue chick not ever being seen again was pretty weird. Oh, and then one small little tidbit is that Sydney Sweeney doesn't really know that much Italian as she goes into this Italian convent, but then she's seen like wandering off into like creepy weird territory inside of the convent, which like if I didn't know a language in a new place, I probably wouldn't be going investigating weird sounds if I knew that I wouldn't be able to communicate with other people down there. So that was kind of weird. So yeah, overall it was pretty good. I'm just gonna use a cliche rating system, I guess. Hopefully I can come up with a better rating system after this. I'd give it a 5.5. Like I said, it's worth seeing. Probably wouldn't watch it again, but there's a lot of gore. There's a lot of jump scares if that's what you're into. It's kind of like a gothic, moody atmosphere, and there's even some potential here for speaking to higher society issues like, you know, women's rights and controlling women's bodies, which my wife pointed out to me, which hadn't clicked with me quite yet shortly after the movie ended. So there's a lot to dive into with this movie. We just saw this last night, so this is a pretty fresh review, and who knows, my idea might change as this movie sits with me a little bit. So yeah, overall I think it's going to surprise a lot of people, and it's definitely worth checking out in the theater while it's still fresh. So that you can maybe get some of those great audience reactions happening all around you. But those are my thoughts for right now. What did you guys think of the movie? Make sure to leave us a comment down below. Watch the past videos on the channel. There's a couple of fun ones up there. We'll be doing more movie reveals throughout the year. So make sure to come back to Nonstop Horror for more fun, interesting, and informative videos around the best genre out there, horror. And remember to embrace the fear all year round.